The moment the music started, I knew something was wrong. The church smelled like white roses and polished wood, the kind of place where everything was supposed to feel sacred, permanent, untouched by anything ugly. But my hands were trembling inside my lace gloves, and no one seemed to notice. Not my mother in the front pew dabbing her eyes. Not the guests whispering about how perfect everything looked. Not even me until it was too late. Until the doors at the back creaked open just slightly off rhythm with the ceremony, and a man I had never seen before stepped inside like he didn't belong to the same world as the rest of us. His shoes echoing too loudly against marble floors. His presence bending the air in a way I couldn't explain, and I remember thinking, this isn't part of the plan. This isn't how my wedding is supposed to go. But my feet kept moving down the aisle, measured steps, exactly like we rehearsed, exactly like every girl is taught to dream. Except dreams don't usually come with warning signs you choose to ignore, and his eyes were on me the entire time, not curious, not admiring, just certain, like he already knew how this would end. And when I finally reached the altar, when I finally looked up expecting to see the man I was about to marry, I saw hesitation instead, a flicker of something I couldn't name, something that made my chest tighten before a single word was spoken, and then it happened so fast it didn't feel real at first. The stranger closed the distance between us in a few calm steps. No rush, no panic, just intention, and before anyone could react, before anyone could even process what they were seeing, his hand caught the delicate fabric of my dress and tore it just enough to break the illusion, not enough to harm, but enough to shatter the perfection everyone had been watching. Gasps rippled through the room. My mother stood. Someone dropped a program. But he didn't look at any of them, only me, leaning in close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear as the world seemed to pause around us. And then he whispered, low and steady, like a secret meant only for me. Your groom isn't coming, little Vietnamese dove, and everything inside me went quiet. No scream, no tears, just silence spreading through my chest like something breaking without sound. Because in that moment, I knew he wasn't guessing. He wasn't guessing at all, and when I turned slightly, just enough to glance toward the man who was supposed to be standing beside me forever, I saw it in his face. The truth he hadn't said yet, the truth everyone else was about to learn. And suddenly the church didn't feel sacred anymore. It felt like a stage where something had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. And the stranger straightened, not touching me again, not forcing anything, just watching as if he had already made his move and the rest of us were simply catching up. And for the first time that day, I stopped walking toward the future I thought I wanted and realized I had been standing at the edge of something else entirely. The silence did not last long because silence never survives a room full of people who expected a perfect ending. It cracked under the weight of whispers, under the sharp intake of breath from guests who suddenly realized they were no longer watching a celebration, but something unraveling in real time. And I could feel every eye on me, not with sympathy but curiosity, the kind that waits to see how badly something will fall apart. And I hated that more than anything. I hated that this moment was no longer mine, that it had been taken and reshaped into something I could not control. So I turned fully this time, my heart pounding hard enough to make my vision blur slightly. And I looked at Daniel, the man who was supposed to be standing beside me, the man who had promised me a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. And for a second, just 1 second, I waited for him to deny it, to laugh, to call this some kind of mistake. But he did not move, he did not step forward, he did not even meet my eyes. And that was when the truth settled in, heavy and cold. Because people who are innocent do not look away, they do not stay silent when everything is about to collapse. They fight. And he did not fight for me. He did not fight at all. Emily, he finally said, my name sounding unfamiliar in his voice, thinner, weaker, like it had already started to disappear. I can explain, but explanations come too late when trust has already broken. And I shook my head before he could say anything else, because I did not want to hear it. I did not want to hear how long he had known, how long he had planned whatever this was. And behind me, I could still feel the presence of the stranger, steady, unmoved, as if none of this surprised him, as if this had always been the outcome. And that realization sent something sharp through my chest, because it meant he knew more than I did about my own life, about my own choices, and I did not like that. I did not like him. I did not like the way he stood there without raising his voice, without needing to, because power does not need volume. It only needs certainty, and somehow, everyone else in the room seemed to understand that too. Because no one stopped him, no one told him to leave, not even the staff, not even the security that had been hired to protect this event. It was as if the rules had shifted the moment he walked in, as if we were no longer in a church, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere he controlled, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, trying to hold on to something that still made sense, but nothing did, not anymore. What do you mean he is not coming? I asked, my voice quieter than I expected, because part of me still needed to hear it said clearly, needed to force this moment into something real instead of a nightmare I could wake up from. And when I turned slightly back toward the stranger, his gaze met mine without hesitation, calm, unwavering, and for a brief second, something in his expression shifted, not softness, not kindness, but something close to restraint, like he was choosing his next words carefully. I mean, he said, his tone even, controlled. The man you were about to marry made a decision long before today, and my stomach dropped. Because I knew what that meant even before he finished. I knew it in the way Daniel took a step back instead of forward, in the way the distance between us grew without a single word. And I hated that it took a stranger to say it out loud. I hated that he was the one holding the truth while I stood there in a dress that no longer meant anything. He chose something else. The stranger continued, and this time, his voice lowered just enough that it felt like the words were meant only for me again. And he thought you would never find out. And that was when the last piece fell into place, not all at once, but slowly, painfully, like a realization my mind had been avoiding. Because the signs had been there, the late nights, the unanswered calls, the way Daniel had stopped looking at me the same way weeks ago, and I had ignored it. I had told myself it was stress, that it was normal, that everything would be fine once we made it to this day. But this day was here now, and nothing was fine, nothing was even close. And as the weight of that settled over me, I realized something else too, something that scared me more than the betrayal, more than the humiliation, more than the whispers growing louder around us. I realized that the only person in that room who seemed completely certain of what came next was the man who had just destroyed my wedding without raising his voice. And I did not know yet if that made him my enemy or the only one who had been telling me the truth all along. No one told the guests to leave, but somehow the room began to shrink anyway, conversations lowering into tight whispers that pressed against my ears like static, and I could feel the weight of judgment settling in, not loud, not obvious, but there, crawling under my skin, turning my perfect day into something people would talk about long after they forgot my name. And I refused to let that be the only thing that defined this moment. So I straightened, ignoring the tear in my dress, ignoring the way my hands still trembled, and I stepped away from the altar, away from Daniel, because staying there felt like accepting something I did not agree to, something I did not choose, and I would not stand in a place that no longer belonged to me. Say it clearly, I said, my voice steadier now, even if it did not feel that way inside. Tell everyone what decision he made. And the stranger watched me for a second, not surprised, not impressed, just measuring, like he had expected this version of me to surface eventually. And when he spoke again, he did not raise his voice, but somehow every person in that church heard him anyway. He arranged to settle a debt, he said simply, and the words landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because debt meant something specific, something deliberate, something chosen. And I felt my chest tighten again as I turned back to Daniel, waiting for him to deny it, to interrupt, to call this a lie. But he did not. He just stood there with that same expression, that same silence that had already told me everything I needed to know, and suddenly the pieces started fitting together in a way I had not allowed before. The expensive venues he insisted on, the sudden urgency to move the wedding date forward, the conversations he took outside, the way he would say everything was handled without explaining how. And I had trusted him. I had trusted him because that is what you do when you are about to build a life with someone. You believe them. You believe in them. And now that belief felt like something fragile I had handed over without realizing how easily it could be broken. You used me, I said, not loudly, not accusing, just stating something that had already become true the moment he chose silence over me. And he flinched, just slightly. like the words reached him even if nothing else had. "It was not supposed to happen like this," he replied, his voice strained, and that almost made me laugh, because nothing ever happens the way people plan when the foundation is built on something hidden, something dishonest. And I shook my head again, not out of disbelief anymore, but out of clarity, because I could see it now, clearly, painfully, exactly for what it was. And behind me, I felt movement, subtle but deliberate, and when I glanced back, I noticed something I had not fully registered before. The men near the doors, the way they stood, the way no one tried to pass them, the way the exits felt further away than they should have been. And it clicked, not all at once, but enough to understand that this moment was not just about me and Daniel. It was about something bigger, something that had been decided before I ever walked down that aisle. And I turned back to the stranger, meeting his gaze fully this time, because I was done looking away from things I did not understand. "What kind of debt?" I asked, and there was a brief pause, not hesitation, but consideration, like he was deciding how much truth I was ready to hear. And when he answered, his voice was quieter again, meant only for me despite the crowded room around us, the kind that gets paid in something more valuable than money. And a chill ran through me, not because of fear exactly, but because I understood the implication without needing him to explain further. And for a moment, everything else faded, the guests, the whispers, the broken image of what this day was supposed to be. All of it became background noise to one simple, undeniable realization. I had almost walked into something I did not choose, something I did not even know existed. And the only reason I was standing here now, seeing it clearly, was because a stranger had decided to step in and tear the illusion apart before it was too late. The air felt different now, heavier, like the truth had weight, and it had just been dropped into the center of the room for everyone to carry whether they wanted to or not. And I could see it in their faces. The guests who had come here expecting champagne and celebration, now watching something far more real unfold, something uncomfortable, something they would pretend not to understand later. And for the first time since this started, I stopped caring what they thought, because whatever version of me they had come to see no longer existed. It had been replaced by someone standing in a torn dress asking questions she should have asked long ago. And that realization did not break me the way I thought it would. It steadied me, just enough to turn fully toward the man who had walked into my life like a storm that did not need to announce itself. "You knew," I said, not as a question, but as a fact I could no longer ignore. And his gaze did not shift, did not soften. It simply held mine with that same quiet certainty that made everything else feel smaller, less important. "I do not involve myself in things I do not understand," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear this had never been random, never been coincidence, and I felt a flicker of something I could not name, not gratitude, not trust, but recognition, because in a room full of people who had watched me walk toward something false, he had been the only one willing to interrupt it. And that mattered more than I wanted it to, more than I was ready to admit. "Why?" I asked, my voice lower now, more controlled, because if I was going to stand here, I needed answers, not just fragments of truth. "Why stop it?" And for a brief second, something changed in his expression, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to catch it, like a thought he chose not to show. "Because some transactions should not be completed," he said, and the word transaction landed differently this time, sharper, clearer, because now I understood what he meant, understood what I had almost become without ever agreeing to it. And the anger that followed was not loud, not explosive. It was quiet and focused, directed exactly where it belonged. And I turned back to Daniel one last time, not searching for answers anymore, just confirming what I already knew. "How much?" I asked, and the question seemed to surprise him more than anything else had, his eyes lifting to meet mine for the first time since this began. "What?" he said, like he did not understand. But he did. We both knew he did. "How much was I worth?" I repeated, each word steady, deliberate, because if he was going to reduce me to something negotiable, then I was going to force him to face it out loud. And for a moment, he said nothing, and that silence said more than any number ever could. Because hesitation only exists when the truth is something you do not want to admit. And I nodded slowly, not because I accepted it, but because I understood it now, completely, And understanding changes things. It changes how you stand, how you breathe, how you decide what comes next. And when I turned away from him, it did not feel like loss anymore. It felt like leaving something behind that had never truly belonged to me in the first place. And as I faced the stranger again, the one person in this room who had not lied to me even once, I realized something else too, something that settled deep in my chest with a clarity I could not ignore. Whatever came next was no longer about a wedding that had been ruined. It was about a choice I had not made before, and the way he looked at me, calm, waiting, like he already knew I was standing at the edge of it, made it clear that walking away would not be as simple as stepping out those doors, because the world I thought I understood had already shifted, and the only question left was whether I was ready to see what it looked like from his side of it. The choice did not feel like a choice at all. It felt like standing in the middle of a road where both directions had already been decided for me. And I hated that. I hated how quickly everything had shifted from something I believed I controlled into something I barely understood. But I also knew one thing with absolute clarity. Staying here pretending this could still be fixed was not an option. Not anymore. Not after everything that had just been exposed in front of everyone who would never let me forget it. And I could feel their attention still lingering, waiting, expecting me to break, to cry, to run, to give them the ending they were already imagining. But I did none of those things. Instead, I inhaled slowly, steadying myself, and I stepped forward, not toward the altar, not toward Daniel, but toward the only person in this room who had not lied to me, and the movement alone was enough to shift the atmosphere again. Subtle, but undeniable, like a line had just been crossed that could not be undone. If I walk out of here, I said, my voice quieter now but stronger in a way I did not recognize. What happens? And it was not a question asked out of fear. It was a question asked because I needed to understand the rules of a game I had been pulled into. Without warning. And he studied me for a moment. Not surprised, not impatient, just observant. Like he had been waiting for me to ask the right question instead of the obvious ones. If you walk out alone, he said, choosing his words carefully, the story becomes theirs. And I did not need him to explain what that meant. I could already see it. The headlines, the whispers, the way this moment would be rewritten into something smaller, something weaker, something that made me the center of failure instead of the truth that had just been revealed. And I felt something inside me resist that immediately, because I had already been made into something I was not once today. I would not allow it to happen again. And if I do not walk out alone, I asked, holding his gaze, refusing to look away this time. And for a brief second, something almost like approval flickered in his expression, gone as quickly as it appeared. Then the story changes, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer was what made it dangerous, because it meant this was not just about leaving. It was about choosing who controlled what came next, and I glanced around the room one last time, taking it in, the broken version of what this day was supposed to be, the people who would never understand what actually happened here, the man who had almost turned me into something negotiable. And I realized I did not belong in this version of the story anymore. I had already stepped outside of it the moment I asked the question, and there was no going back to who I was before I knew the truth. And that realization settled over me with a strange kind of calm, not relief, not comfort, but certainty, the kind that does not need reassurance, only action. And when I looked back at him, I did not feel like I was being pulled into something unknown anymore. I felt like I was choosing to step into it on my own terms, even if I did not fully understand what those terms were yet. You interrupted my wedding, I said, not accusing, just acknowledging the reality of what he had done, and his expression did not change, did not apologize, did not justify. It simply remained steady, grounded, like he had already accepted whatever judgment came with that decision. I ended something that should not have begun, he replied, and the words stayed with me longer than I expected, because they felt true in a way I could not deny. And for the first time since this all started, I allowed myself to see it differently, not as something taken from me, but as something revealed before it could trap me. And that shift, small as it was, changed everything, because it meant what came next was not about loss, it was about direction. And I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something I could carry, something I could move forward with, and without looking back again, without giving anyone in that room another chance to define what this meant, I took one final step forward, closing the distance between us, not because I trusted him, not yet, but because I trusted the truth he had shown me. And sometimes that is enough to take the first step into a world you never expected to enter. The moment I stepped closer, something shifted in the room that no one announced, but everyone felt, like an invisible line had been crossed, and there was no way to step back over it. And I could sense it in the way the whispers faded, in the way even the smallest movements seemed to pause, as if the entire space was waiting to see what would happen next, not because they cared about me, but because they understood that whatever this was had moved beyond something ordinary. And I felt it too. Not fear exactly, but awareness, sharp and immediate, like I had just walked into a reality that did not operate by the same rules I had lived by my entire life. And for a second, just 1 second, I wondered if I had made a mistake, if stepping toward him instead of away from everything was the wrong choice. But then I remembered the silence from the man who was supposed to stand beside me, the way truth had to be dragged into the light by someone who had no reason to protect me, and the doubt disappeared just as quickly as it came, replaced by something steadier, something that did not need reassurance. And he noticed. I could tell he noticed, because his gaze did not soften, but it sharpened slightly, like he was acknowledging the decision without saying it out loud. And without a word, he reached for his jacket, shrugging it off in one smooth motion before placing it gently over my shoulders, not touching me more than necessary, not claiming, not forcing, just covering the tear in my dress in a way that felt deliberate, controlled. And that simple gesture said more than anything else he had done so far, because power that chooses restraint is something you do not ignore. And I felt the weight of the fabric settle around me, heavier than it should have been, like it carried something more than just warmth, something I could not quite define, and I resisted the instinct to pull it tighter, to hide inside it, because I was not going to disappear from this moment, not anymore. And when I looked up at him again, he was already watching me, waiting, not for permission, but for confirmation. And I gave it with a small nod, not dramatic, not obvious, just enough for him to understand that I was not hesitating anymore. And that was all it took, because the next movement was immediate, precise. The men near the doors stepped aside at the exact same moment, not rushed, not chaotic, just coordinated in a way that made it clear this was not something they were deciding now. This was something they had been prepared to do from the beginning. And the realization sent a quiet chill through me, not because it frightened me, but because it confirmed what I already suspected. This had been planned, not the way it unfolded, but the possibility of it, and I was now part of that possibility whether I fully understood it or not. And as we began to move, not quickly, not dramatically, just walking side by side toward the exit, I could feel every gaze follow us, not questioning, not stopping, just watching, like they knew better than to interfere with something they did not understand. And I did not look back, not at Daniel, not at my family, not at the place where I had been standing just minutes ago believing in something that no longer existed. Because looking back would mean holding on to something that had already been proven false, and I was done holding onto illusions. And as the doors opened, letting in a rush of cooler air that felt almost unreal against my skin, I stepped forward without hesitation, crossing from one world into another without fully knowing what waited on the other side. And as soon as we were outside, the difference was immediate. The quiet was deeper, more controlled, and the cars waiting along the curb were not just transportation, they were presence. They were statement. And I slowed slightly, not stopping, just enough to take it in, to understand that whatever this was, it was bigger than a single moment in a church, bigger than a broken wedding. And when I turned to him again, standing beside me like he had always been there, I realized something that settled into my chest with quiet certainty. I had not just walked away from something false. I had stepped directly into something real. And whether that would protect me or change me in ways I did not yet understand was a question I would have to answer later. Because right now, the only thing that mattered was that I had chosen, and choices like this do not come without consequences. The night air felt colder than it should have for late spring, brushing against my skin like a reminder that I had stepped outside of something familiar and into something I could not measure yet. And as the church doors closed behind us, the sound was soft but final, like a chapter ending without asking if I was ready for it. And I stood there for a moment, not frozen, not hesitant, just aware, taking in the line of dark vehicles parked along the curb, their engines running quietly, their presence controlled. intentional, nothing like the chaos I had just walked away from. And for the first time since this began, I realized how quiet everything around him was, not empty, but disciplined. Like even the air understood its place, and I adjusted the jacket slightly on my shoulders, the fabric still unfamiliar, still carrying a weight that was not just physical. And I wondered briefly how long it had been since I had worn something that did not belong to me, something chosen for a reason I did not fully understand, and the thought lingered just long enough to make me aware of how much had already changed in less than 10 minutes. And when I looked at him again, he had not moved far, just enough to stand slightly ahead of me, not leading in a way that forced me forward, but not waiting either, as if he expected me to decide my own pace, and I respected that more than I expected to, because after everything that had just happened, the absence of pressure felt louder than anything else, and I stepped forward again, closing the small distance between us, without thinking about it too much, because thinking too much felt like something that belonged to the version of me who still believed in certainty, and that version was already gone, and one of the car doors opened before we reached it, not abruptly, not dramatically, just precisely timed, and I paused for half a second, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to understand the moment fully, to register it, to make sure I was not moving through it blindly, and I glanced back once, not at the church itself, but at the space I had just left behind, and it already felt distant, like something that had happened to someone else, and that realization should have scared me, but it did not. It steadied me, because it meant I was no longer tied to it the way I had been just minutes ago, and when I turned forward again, he was watching me, not impatient, not curious, just present, and that presence grounded the moment in a way I could not explain, and I exhaled slowly before stepping closer to the open door, stopping just short of getting in, because there was still one thing I needed to say, one thing I needed to make clear before this moved any further. This does not mean I belong to you, I said, my voice calm, not challenging, not defensive, just honest, because I needed that boundary to exist, even if I did not know how strong it would be in a world I did not understand yet. And for a second, the only response was silence, not dismissive, not uncomfortable, just measured. And then he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without arguing it, without dismissing it, and that alone told me more than any words could have, because it meant he heard me, even if he did not agree. And when he finally spoke, his voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. You belong to yourself, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften or control the meaning, just a statement placed between us like something solid, something that did not need to be defended, and that caught me off guard more than anything else had tonight, not because it was comforting, but because it was unexpected, and I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for something behind the words, some hidden intention, some condition I had missed, but there was nothing obvious, nothing I could immediately challenge, and that unsettled me in a different way, because I had prepared myself for control, for demands, for something clear I could push against, but this was something else entirely, something I could not define yet, and I realized in that moment that stepping into his world was not going to be as simple as resisting or accepting. It was going to be something more complicated, something that required understanding before judgment. And with that thought settling quietly in the back of my mind, I finally moved, lowering myself into the car without rushing, without hesitation, because whatever this was, I had already chosen to see it through, at least far enough to understand what I had stepped into. And as the door closed beside me with a soft, deliberate sound, I realized that the silence inside this new space felt even deeper than outside, like the world I knew had been left behind not just physically, but entirely. And for the first time since I walked down that aisle, I allowed myself to wonder not what I had lost, but what I had just entered. The door sealed the moment in place, not with force but with finality, a quiet click that felt louder than anything that had happened inside the church. And for a few seconds I did not move. I did not speak. I just sat there with my hands resting lightly against my lap, feeling the unfamiliar texture of the jacket still draped over my shoulders, grounding me in a reality that no longer resembled the one I woke up in this morning. And the silence inside the car was not empty. It was deliberate, controlled, like everything else surrounding him. And I realized quickly that this was not the kind of silence that needed to be filled. It was the kind that waited. and that made me more aware of myself than anything else had so far, aware of my breathing, steady but deeper than usual, aware of the faint reflection of my torn dress in the darkened window, distorted slightly by the tinted glass. And I studied it for a moment, not with sadness, not with regret, but with a strange kind of detachment, because the image staring back at me did not look like someone who had just lost something. It looked like someone who had just seen something clearly for the first time, and that difference mattered more than I expected it to. And then the car began to move, smooth and controlled. No sudden acceleration, no rush, just a quiet transition from one place to another. And I felt it in the way the city lights shifted outside, stretching and blending into long streaks of gold and white as we pulled away from the church, away from the version of my life that had ended without ceremony. And I did not turn to look back. Not this time, because I already knew what I would see. A building filled with people trying to make sense of something they were never meant to understand, and I was done trying to fit into explanations that did not belong to me. And beside me, he had taken his seat without drawing attention to it, without breaking the stillness, his presence, filling the space in a way that was impossible to ignore, but did not demand acknowledgement either. And I could feel his gaze occasionally shift toward me, not intrusive, not invasive, just observant, like he was reading something he had not finished understanding yet. And I wondered briefly what he saw, not the dress, not the situation, but me. The version of me sitting here now instead of the one who had been walking down the aisle less than an hour ago. And the thought lingered just long enough to make me aware of the fact that I had not asked his name, not once, not even when he tore through everything I thought I knew. And that realization almost made me smile, because it felt like something I should have done already, something normal in a situation that was anything but, "You never told me your name," I said finally, breaking the silence in a way that felt measured, not rushed. And for a moment, there was no immediate response, just the steady hum of the engine and the soft shift of the city outside. And then he turned slightly, enough for his profile to catch the passing light. Sharp lines, controlled expression, nothing given away without intention. "Adrian," he said, simple, direct, as if the name itself carried enough weight to stand on its own. And I repeated it silently in my mind, testing how it felt, how it fit into everything that had just happened. And it did not feel unfamiliar the way I expected it to. It felt like something that had always been part of this story, just waiting for me to catch up to it. "Emily," I replied after a second, not because he did not already know, but because saying it out loud felt like reclaiming something that had almost been taken from me earlier. And he nodded once, acknowledging it without adding anything else. And that small exchange settled between us like a quiet agreement, not spoken, not defined, but understood. And I leaned back slightly against the seat, letting the motion of the car carry us forward. And for the first time since everything began, I allowed myself to ask a different kind of question, not about what had happened, not about what I had left behind, but about what came next. And I did not ask it out loud, because something told me the answer was not something that could be given in a single sentence. It was something I was already moving toward with every mile we put between me and the life I thought I was going to live. And as the city continued to unfold around us, lights shifting, streets changing, I realized that whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into, it was not temporary. It was not a moment that would fade when the shock wore off. It was something that had already begun shaping what came next. And whether I was ready for that or not was no longer the question, because readiness had never been part of this, only choice, and I had already made mine. The rhythm of the city outside the window began to change the further we drove, the crowded noise of downtown slowly giving way to wider streets, quieter intersections, and buildings that stood with more space between them. Like even the city itself understood the need for distance from everything that had just happened. And I watched it all without really focusing on any one thing, letting the motion carry me while my thoughts settled into something clearer, something less reactive and more deliberate, because the shock had already passed, replaced by a kind of awareness that felt sharper than anything I had experienced before. And I realized that I was no longer trying to make sense of what happened at the church. I was trying to understand what it meant going forward, and that shift mattered, because it meant I was no longer stuck in the moment. I was moving through it, and beside me, Adrian remained composed in a way that felt almost effortless, his posture relaxed but precise, his presence steady. Like he had done this before, not the situation exactly, but the act of stepping into chaos and leaving with control intact. And I found myself studying that without meaning to, not out of admiration, but curiosity, because people like him did not move without reason. They did not act without understanding the outcome. And that meant this was not just about stopping my wedding. It was about something else, something I had not fully uncovered yet. You said it was a debt. I spoke again, breaking the quiet without hesitation this time, because silence no longer felt like something I needed to hold on to. And he turned his head slightly, acknowledging the question without surprise, like he expected it eventually. It was, he answered simply, and I exhaled slowly, not frustrated, just focused, because I had already learned that he did not offer more than he chose to. And if I wanted answers, I needed to ask better questions. And you decided to interfere. I continued, keeping my tone even, not accusing, not emotional, just direct. And there was a pause before he responded, not hesitation, but consideration, like he was deciding how much truth to place in front of me at once. I decided it was not acceptable, he said, and the words landed differently than I expected, not defensive, not dismissive, just final. And I turned slightly toward him, narrowing my focus, because that answer raised more questions than it resolved. Not acceptable to who? I asked, and for a brief second, something almost like a faint shift in expression passed across his face, not irritation, not amusement, just acknowledgement of the direction the conversation was taking. To me, he replied. And that was it. No explanation, no justification, just a statement that carried enough weight to stand alone. And I leaned back slightly, absorbing that, because it told me something important, something I could not ignore. This was not about rules I understood, not about laws or agreements I could define. It was about his judgment, his line, his decision, and that made everything more complicated, not less, because it meant I was now connected to something that operated on a level I had never experienced before. And yet, despite that realization, I did not feel the fear I expected. I felt something closer to caution, measured and aware, because there was a difference between stepping into danger blindly and stepping into something unknown with your eyes open. And I had chosen the second, and that mattered. And the car slowed slightly as we approached a quieter street, lined with tall trees and evenly spaced lights that cast a soft glow across the pavement, and I noticed the change. Immediately, not just in the surroundings, but in the atmosphere, because this place felt different, more controlled, more private, like it existed just outside the reach of everything else. And as we turned into a long driveway that curved gently away from the main road, I felt the shift again, subtle but undeniable, like crossing another invisible line, and I straightened slightly, my attention sharpening, because whatever waited at the end of this drive was not just a destination, it was the next step in something I had already committed to without fully understanding. And when I glanced at Adrian again, he was already looking ahead, focused, composed, like this part of the world belonged to him in a way the church never had. And that realization settled into my mind with quiet clarity. I had not just left something behind. I had entered somewhere that operated entirely on his terms, and the only question left was how long it would take for me to understand exactly what those terms were. The car slowed to a near stop as the driveway curved one final time, revealing a structure that did not try to impress with excess but commanded attention through precision, clean lines, expansive glass, and soft lighting placed exactly where it needed to be, nothing accidental, nothing unnecessary, and I felt it immediately, the same controlled presence that surrounded him now reflected in the space ahead. Like this place was not just where he lived, but an extension of how he thought. Measured, deliberate, impossible to misunderstand once you stepped close enough. And the vehicle came to a smooth halt beneath a covered entrance, the engine fading into silence that felt deeper than before, more contained. And for a second, neither of us moved, not out of hesitation, but because movement here seemed to follow its own timing, its own rhythm, and I realized that everything about this moment was intentional, even the pause, even the quiet, and I let my eyes take in the details without rushing. The way the exterior lights cast long shadows across the stone, the subtle reflection of trees in the glass panels, the absence of noise from anything beyond this space, like the world outside had been filtered down to only what mattered here, and it was not intimidating in the way I expected. It was something else, something steadier, something that made you aware of your place within it whether you wanted to acknowledge it or not. And then the door beside me opened, not abruptly, not with urgency, just precisely on time. And I stepped out without waiting to be asked, my heels meeting the smooth surface beneath with a soft, controlled sound that seemed to echo just enough to remind me I was no longer in the chaos I had left behind. And the air here felt different too, cooler, cleaner, like even the environment had been curated, and I adjusted the jacket again slightly, aware of its presence but no longer unsettled by it, because it had already become part of this moment, part of the transition I had chosen to step into. And when I looked toward him, he had already moved ahead by a step or two, not leaving me behind, not guiding me forward, just existing in a space that seemed to respond to him without question, and that subtle distinction stayed with me as I followed, because it meant something important, something I was still learning to define. And as we approached the entrance, the doors opened before we reached them, smooth and silent, revealing an interior that mirrored everything outside, wide open space, minimal design, light placed with intention instead of decoration, and I stepped inside with a quiet awareness that I had crossed yet another boundary, one that did not need to be announced to be understood, and the warmth inside wrapped around me immediately, not overwhelming, just enough to contrast the night air I had left behind. And I paused, just inside the threshold, not because I was uncertain, but because I needed a second to take it in, to register that this was now where I stood, that the distance between my past and this moment was no longer measured in miles but in choices. And behind me, the doors closed with that same soft finality I had already begun to recognize, sealing the transition in a way that felt almost symbolic. And I turned slightly, not toward the exit, but toward him, because at this point, everything that mattered was moving forward, not back. And he met my gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged, composed, like nothing about this situation disrupted his sense of control. And for a moment, the silence between us stretched again, not empty, not awkward, just present, like it was waiting for something to define the next step. And I realized that whatever came next was not going to be explained to me in advance. It was something I would have to step into the same way I had stepped into everything else tonight, without full understanding, but with clear awareness. And that realization did not make me hesitate. It steadied me, because I had already crossed too many lines to pretend I could go back to where I started. And I exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle into something I could carry, something I could move through. And when I spoke, my voice was calm, grounded in a way I did not recognize from earlier. So this is where your decisions begin, I said, not accusing, not questioning, just acknowledging the reality of what I had stepped into. And his response came without delay, quiet but certain. No, he replied, his gaze steady on mine. This is where yours do. And the words landed with a clarity that shifted something inside me again, because they reframed everything, not as something being done to me, but something I was now part of by choice. And as I stood there in a place that reflected a world I had never known, I understood something that would not leave me. Whatever this was, whatever I had entered, it was no longer about what had been taken from me. It was about what I would choose to become within it. His words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the space between us with a weight that did not need repetition. And for a moment I did not respond, not because I did not understand, but because I did, more than I expected to. And that understanding felt unfamiliar in a way that was difficult to ignore, because it shifted responsibility back onto me, not as something forced, but something undeniable. And I realized that stepping into this place was not about being taken somewhere. It was about choosing to stand here, fully aware that what came next would not be decided for me unless I allowed it. And that thought steadied me in a way nothing else had since this began, and I let my gaze move briefly around the space again, not searching for details anymore, but grounding myself in it, in the quiet, in the structure, in the sense that everything here existed exactly as intended. And then I looked back at him, because at this point, avoiding him would have meant avoiding the truth I had already chosen to face. Then I need to understand what I stepped into, I said, my voice calm, not demanding, just direct, because clarity was no longer optional. It was necessary. And he studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable but not distant, like he was measuring not just the question, but the intent behind it. And when he spoke, it was with the same controlled tone he had used from the beginning. "You stepped away from a lie," he said first, not answering the question yet, but placing the foundation beneath it. And I held his gaze, waiting, because I knew by now that he chose his words with purpose, that nothing he said was accidental. And after a brief pause, he continued, "What you stepped into is not something you will understand all at once." And that was not surprising, not really, because nothing about tonight had been simple or immediate. But I did not look away, I did not step back, because uncertainty was no longer something that pushed me away. It was something I had already accepted, and he seemed to register that, because there was a slight shift in his posture, subtle but present, like he had decided something without saying it out loud. "This world does not explain itself," he added, and there was no warning in his voice, no attempt to intimidate, just a statement of fact, and I absorbed that quietly, letting it settle into something I could work with instead of something I needed to resist, because resistance without understanding would only leave me in the same position I had been in before, blind to what was actually happening around me. And I had already learned that lesson once tonight. I was not going to repeat it. "Then I will learn it," I replied after a second, not out of confidence, but out of decision, because waiting for clarity to arrive on its own was not something I was willing to do anymore. And his gaze held mine a fraction longer this time, not challenging, not approving, just acknowledging the choice behind the words. And that acknowledgement mattered more than I expected, because it meant I was not being dismissed, I was being observed, considered, and that shifted the dynamic in a way I could feel even if I could not fully define it. Yet, and for a moment, neither of us spoke again, the silence settling into something quieter, less tense, like the initial edge of uncertainty had softened into something more stable. And I realized then that this was not about immediate answers, it was about positioning, about where I chose to stand in a situation that could easily overwhelm me if I allowed it. And I adjusted my posture slightly, not defensively, but deliberately, grounding myself in the space instead of standing at the edge of it. And he noticed. I could tell he noticed, because nothing about his attention wavered, nothing about his awareness shifted away. And that consistency was something I was beginning to understand, something I could rely on even if I did not yet trust it fully. And then he moved, not abruptly, not with urgency, just turning slightly and gesturing toward the deeper part of the house, an invitation without pressure, a direction without demand. And I followed, not because I was being led, but because I had already decided to move forward. And as we walked further inside, the space opened into something larger, more expansive, and I felt it again, that quiet realization settling into place. With more clarity than before, this was not just a place, it was a world with its own rules, its own structure, and I was no longer standing outside of it trying to understand from a distance. I was inside it now, and whatever came next would not be about asking what it meant. It would be about learning how to exist within it without losing the part of myself that had chosen to step in willingly. The deeper we moved into the house, the more I began to notice the details that did not demand attention but revealed themselves quietly. The way the lighting shifted subtly from one space to another, never harsh, never dim, always intentional. The way every surface felt chosen rather than placed, as if nothing here existed without purpose. And it made me more aware of my own presence within it, not uncomfortable, but deliberate, like I was being asked to decide how I would stand in a place that did not adjust itself for anyone. And I slowed slightly as we entered a wider living area, the openness of it almost deceptive in how calm it appeared, because beneath that calm was structure, something precise and controlled, and I could feel it even without seeing anything that explained it directly. And Adrian stopped a few steps ahead, turning just enough to face me again, not blocking my path, not guiding it, just placing himself in a position where the next moment would be defined by what I chose to do. And I recognized that pattern now. The way he allowed space without relinquishing presence, the way he did not instruct but still influenced everything around him. And it made me more aware of my own movements, more intentional in how I carried myself, because I understood that reacting without thought would only place me at a disadvantage in a world that clearly did not operate on impulse. And I let my gaze settle on him fully. No hesitation this time. No uncertainty about meeting his eyes. Because whatever this was, whatever I had stepped into, I was no longer standing at the edge of it trying to decide whether to turn back. You said this world does not explain itself, I said, my voice steady, not challenging, just continuing the thread we had already begun, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the connection without interrupting. Then I need to know what it expects, I added, because understanding expectation meant understanding how to move within it without losing control of myself. And there was a brief silence after that, not empty, but measured, like he was considering not just the question but the reason behind it. And when he spoke, his tone remained even, grounded in the same quiet authority that had been present from the beginning. It expects awareness, he said, and the simplicity of the answer made it more significant, not less, because awareness was not something you could pretend to have. It was something you either chose or ignored, and I absorbed that without responding immediately, letting it settle into something I could build from. Because awareness meant paying attention, not just to him, not just to this place, but to myself, to the decisions I made and the reasons behind them. And I realized then that this was not about learning a set of rules. It was about learning how to see clearly in a space where nothing was hidden, but nothing was explained either. And that realization shifted something inside me again, not dramatically, but enough to change how I stood, how I thought about what came next, because it meant I was not being asked to become someone else. I was being asked to understand more deeply who I already was and how that would hold up in a world that did not tolerate illusions. And I took a slow breath, grounding myself in that thought, because it gave me something solid to stand on, something that belonged to me regardless of where I was. And when I looked at him again, there was no hesitation left in my expression, no lingering doubt about whether I should be here. Only the recognition that I had already chosen this path and that understanding it was now part of that choice. Then I will pay attention, I said quietly, not as a promise to him, but as a decision for myself. And for the first time since I had met him, there was the slightest shift in his expression, subtle enough that most people would miss it, but I did not anymore, because awareness meant noticing the smallest changes, the ones that mattered more than anything obvious. And that shift told me something important, not approval, not satisfaction, but recognition, like he had acknowledged the difference between someone reacting to a situation and someone stepping into it with intention. And that mattered more than any explanation he could have given, because it meant I was no longer being measured against what I did not understand. I was being observed for how I chose to understand it. And that realization settled into place with a quiet certainty that did not need reinforcement, because it felt true in a way nothing else had since this began. And as the silence returned, it did not feel uncertain anymore. It felt stable, like the space between us had shifted from something undefined into something that held structure, something that would continue to build with every choice I made from this point forward. And for the first time since I walked down that aisle, I did not feel like I was reacting to what had been taken from me. I felt like I was standing in front of something I could shape, something that would not define me unless I allowed it to, and that difference was enough to change everything about how I faced whatever came next. I did not realize how quiet I had become until I noticed that I was no longer searching for the next question, no longer trying to fill the space with words just to understand where I stood, because for the first time since everything began, I did not feel like I was standing in uncertainty. I felt like I was standing in something that was still unfolding, but no longer hidden from me. And that difference settled into my chest with a kind of calm I did not expect to find here, in a place that should have felt unfamiliar, but somehow did not. And I let my gaze move once more across the room, not studying it this time, not analyzing, just seeing it for what it was, a space built on intention, on clarity, on decisions that did not ask for permission. And I understood then why it did not feel chaotic, because nothing here was left to chance. And that realization stayed with me as I turned back to Adrian, meeting his gaze without hesitation, because hesitation no longer belonged to this version of me, not after everything that had been revealed, not after everything I had chosen. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, but the silence no longer felt like something waiting to be broken. It felt like something already understood, like the space between us had shifted into something steadier, something that did not need to be defined out loud to exist. And I took a slow breath, grounding myself in that awareness, because I knew now that whatever came next would not be explained in simple terms. It would be something I experienced, something I learned by moving through it instead of standing outside of it. And that thought did not intimidate me the way it should have. It focused me, because I had already seen what happened when I ignored what was in front of me, when I trusted something without understanding it. And I would not make that mistake again. Not here, not now. I almost married something I did not see. I said quietly, not as a confession, not as regret, but as a statement of fact, something that no longer held power over me because I had already stepped away from it. And he did not interrupt, did not respond. Immediately, just listened, and that alone mattered, because it meant this was not about controlling what I said or how I understood it. It was about allowing the truth to exist without distortion, and I let the words settle before continuing, my voice steady, clearer than it had been all night. I will not do that again. And this time, when he responded, there was no pause, no consideration needed. Then you will not, he said, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than anything else he could have added, because it did not question me. It did not challenge me. It acknowledged the decision as something real, something that would define what came next, and I felt something shift inside me again, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough to recognize it, because it was not fear, it was not doubt, it was something closer to resolve, something that had been building quietly through every moment since I stepped into that church, every realization, every truth I had chosen to face instead of ignore, and now it had settled into something solid, something I could carry forward without hesitation. And I realized then that this was not about him, not entirely, not even about the world I had stepped into. It was about me, about the choices I made when I was no longer willing to pretend. And that clarity changed everything, because it meant I was not here by accident. I was here because I chose to be, and that choice would shape whatever came next more than anything else. And as the silence returned once more, it felt different now, not heavy, not uncertain, but grounded, like the beginning of something that did not need to announce itself to be real. And I held his gaze one last time, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging the moment for what it was, the point where everything I thought I understood had ended and something else had begun, something I had not planned, something I had not imagined, but something I had chosen anyway. And as I stood there, no longer the bride who had walked down that aisle believing in a future that was never truly hers, but someone who had seen the truth and stepped forward regardless, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. He did not take me away from my life. He revealed it. And now that I could see it clearly, there was no going back to who I